Hello lovely people, welcome to another book chat, the regular but not monthly roundup of what I've been reading recently. I have 7 books to talk about this week. I'm going to try and be concise so we can get through them all, and let's just dive in.
Sophie Vlogs.
First of all, where to even begin? Oh good lord. Okay, first of all I'm going to start with The Heart of a Woman by Maya Angelou. I bloody love Maya Angelou. This was as great as all the rest of the Maya Angelou I've read. Every time I read one of her books, I go in knowing that it's going to be brilliant. So I've been reading through her autobiographies. I don't have Singing and Swinging and Getting Merry Like Christmas, so I've had to fill in the gaps a bit from Gather Together in My Name to this one. This was really interesting because this focuses on the time of her life where she starts to become more of a political activist. Maybe she's doing that in Singing and Swinging and Getting Merry Like Christmas, but I missed that bit. So for me, this is the first one I've read where she's really like being a political activist, and it's a lot about her involvement with, I can't remember the name of the organisation, but the one that was involved with Martin Luther King, and to do with some of the theatre performances she put on in support of that. She also begins a relationship with a South African man who is very involved with the civil rights movement there. So she ends up travelling away from America towards the end of this book. And that was also very interesting. So I never feel like I have much in depth to say about these because they are always just fantastically interesting. Maya Angelou has a beautiful way of writing. But this was very interesting to see her develop politically. Another sort of like civil rights related book I finished is No Easy Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela. I've been reading this on and off for a while. I've been dipping in and out. I watched the film Mandela with Idris Elba in, which was a really good film, and so I thought I'd read this to get a little bit more context of the actual real background to that rather than like an interpretation through film. So this was very interesting to read Mandela's actual words and his speeches. This is like a collection of his writings and writings that were distributed by the ANC officially, and then also part of his trial is in this, and then the final speeches he gave at certain trials. And this was just immensely powerful. He was an amazing speaker, and to read it, you can really you can hear his voice in your head saying it, and there are just moments which are just incredibly powerful and just generally a very interesting read to actually read his own words rather than seeing here is an actor pretending to be him saying them. I've actually got a fair amount of non-fiction in this, so I will do all my non-fiction first and then I'll end on some fiction. So after that we've got Stone of Destiny by Ian Hamilton. So the Stone of Destiny is this stone which the kings of Scotland have always been crowned on. I think it was Edward III who stole it and took it to England, and then it was kept in Westminster Abbey for years and years and years. And in the 50s, Ian Hamilton, who was a student in Scotland at the time, decided that he was going to steal it back and take it back to Scotland where it rightfully belongs. And so essentially him and some of his other student friends just sort of planned this thing, and then they broke into Westminster Abbey, and then they stole the stone, and then they hid it for a bit and brought it back to Scotland. And this is his account of that, and it was very interesting. The Stone of Destiny is now back in Scotland. It is in Edinburgh Castle. It was returned eventually, but this was interesting. A, I think he raises some very valid points, but also B, he planned it, they did it, and he did it with these other people, and then they all went their separate ways, and they just never really saw each other again. And I find it really interesting that he has a lot of respect for them at all, but it's not like they did this thing so then they could dine out on it for years and years to come. They never saw each other again. They did a thing, because they all agreed that it should be done, and then they just sort of carried on with their lives. That was a really interesting aspect. It was also kind of funny to just be because they had to try a couple of times because he got caught and blah blah blah, things went wrong, and it was almost funny how certain things happen, and sometimes it feels a little bit like it could be like a film, but it is actually true and it is what happened. It's also just a very easy read, so this was a lot of fun actually. My final non-fiction is a really small little book, and this is Bees in History, Religion and Law by Fez Baker. This is absolutely lovely. I bought this at Thought Bubble Comics Festival. I'll show you inside. Essentially, it's all about the folklore of bees, but it has these beautiful full-page illustrations, and it just explores, okay, so from the contents page, history, religion, law, and just it talks about bees, all the different types of bees, our history with bees, like all the various roles that bees have to play in religions throughout the world. And it was just like really delightful. I like bees. I think we should all like bees. They're very important. Not just the ones that make honey, but all of them. And it was just really, really lovely. And all of these illustrations, this artwork style, it's just beautiful. And it's absolutely gorgeous. I have another of Fez Baker's books, which is a bit bigger, which is all about like wildflowers and herbs and stuff like this. And I'm really excited to read that soon as well. Following on from that, we have The Woman Who Loved an Octopus and Other Saints' Tales by Imogen, Rhia, Herrod. This is looking at Welsh saints. I thought this was going to be just telling me the stories of Welsh saints, but what it actually is each time it starts off, you have like a little summary of the saint, the actual saint story, and then she's done modern, she's like set their tales again in modern times. Some of them worked really well, some of them I didn't care so much for. I would heartily recommend, I'm going to mispronounce this, Melangel and Dwynwen, and this one like blends their stories together and combines them. It was the only one that combined Saints' Tales, but it was my favourite because I really liked the way they sort of mirrored each other's story a little bit. It's interesting because a lot of the Welsh female saints, at least that are featured in this, have a lot of commonality. A lot of them get their heads chopped off. A lot of them just want to like have the freedom to like marry who they want or not marry who they want. Like, oh no, that didn't make sense. Marry who they want or not get married. You know, like a lot of it is just like these women being like, hey, I'm just not going to do what you're telling me and I'm going to go do this thing instead. And then like maybe it involves also like worshipping God a little bit. But essentially, I didn't like all of these stories. I gave this a 3 stars in total. It's just the story of Melangel and Dwynwen, the way it was weaved together and made kind of a little bit gay. I was into it. Loved that bit. After that, we've got The Murder in the Tower by Jean Plaidy. I was a Jean Plaidy obsessed little child. I used to go on holiday, we went on holiday to Wales a lot, and I would comb these little second-hand bookshops for Jean Plaidy books, and I would hoard them and read them, and I loved them. And a lot of it was like my introduction to history, because my family really loves history, and I really love history, and I was just... Jean Plaidy was my way in. So I have a couple of these left over that I've never read yet, because I sort of was like, maybe I will save them and occasionally dip in, which is what I did with this. So, this is set in the reign of James I/James IV of Scotland, focuses on Frances Howard, and Frances Howard she's like, obviously, the Howards were a big family, Tudor times, etc. Frances Howard was originally the mistress of the Prince of Wales, Henry, who never became king, and that was an interesting feature, was looking at Henry in this, and Prince Henry died young, which is why Charles became Charles I, which is an interesting dynamic because Henry, as what sort of a king would Henry have been, and obviously Charles, you had a lot of physical issues, had a lot of issues speaking initially, not your, this guy's going to be our king, not a natural choice, given what was prioritised as kingly attributes. But then, because Prince Henry died so young, obviously Charles did become king, and it didn't go great, because he lost his head. But that exploration in this was interesting. But back to Frances, after being mistress of Prince of Wales, became mistress of Robert Carr, who was one of James I's favourites. James I really favoured, like, these beautiful young men. And then it sort of just looks at the relationship between them. It's a little bit like, I don't know, like, we're like, oh, she's pretty much selling her soul for witchcraft to try and keep this man. But I think Jean Plaidy does an interesting way of showing you that what Frances thinks is a result of her paying a shit ton of money to dodgy people is actually like, oh, look, this kind of would have happened anyway because there's these other external circumstances going on. And it was an interesting exploration. It's not really a story that I knew much about. It's not a piece of history that I had previously learnt, so that was good. Jane Plaidy are always quite fun. I take it all with a pinch of salt because she's not a historian, she's writing historical fiction, but they're very enjoyable and engaging. Finally, we have a beast of a book that I started reading in 2017 and have finished now, finally. The story, Love, Loss and the Lives of Women, 100 Great Short Stories, chosen by Victoria Hislop. I've been dipping in and out of this for a very, very long time because short stories are not something that you can just blitz through in a, like, little tiny weekend. Good Lord, this book took me ages. It's kind of hard to review such a short story collection because there were 100 stories in it, and obviously some of them I thought were really great, and some of them I didn't like. This was an interesting way of learning a couple of new authors who I might want to check out, and also reading stories by authors who I previously read full novels of, and seeing how they do short story-wise. That was interesting. I think there is a limited view on women. For example, some of the short stories didn't really seem to have anything to do with the lives of women, really. And also the types of women whose voices we heard and who narratively we focused on was, I felt, a bit limited in a lot of ways. There was like this particular, I don't know, there were a lot of stories that felt very, even though what was happening was different, the type of woman felt very similar to me. Like, for example, this was a very straight collection. Everyone was quite heterosexual. There wasn't a lot of variety in that. I'm sure there's loads of other things. Like, I don't really remember a lot of stories that were focusing on, like, poor women. Like, stuff like this. Like, I just felt like, bearing in mind it's about the lives, the loves, losses, and lives of women, there was a limitation. That being said, there were loads of different, like, historical focuses on this, stuff like that. That was good. I mean, it's very hard to review because it's so big. I've been reading it for so long. But it was good, it was enjoyable. I'm not going to keep it because it was so huge. It will just take, I don't even know if it will fit on my shelves at this point. But yes, I read it. It's probably one of the longest books, apart from Anna Karenina, it's probably one of the longest books I've ever actually finished. And I could beat someone to death with it, if nothing else. Maybe. Not that that's what I do with my books. Anyway, right. This is turning into a ramble, so I'm going to wrap it up. Have you read any of these? Do you have thoughts on any of these? Would love to hear them, as per usual. Other than that, I hope you're super duper well, and I will see you next week for something different.